I'd like to say thank you to you for being invited on behalf of myself and co-author Tom Ryan. It's an honor to be here tonight. This is my first work with the Zoom format, and considering what's going on in the country is probably the smartest and the safest way to conduct something like this. It's always nice to have one-on-one and direct conversation with individuals, but if that's not possible, this is probably as good an option as you can get. But I would like to thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to you tonight about the book that Tom and I wrote.
Okay.
So can
the
we
floor
go?
is yours.
The floor is mine. All right. Okay, let's get started. Getting the slides up.
Muted it, everybody.
All right, in front of you, what you see now is the cover of the book, which was an Edwin Forbes painting of the pursuit of Lee's army by the Army of the Potomac. And it is an excellent representation of the pursuit by General Meade's Army of the Potomac, conducted for a great deal of the time in rain and really bad weather. So from the beginning of the concept of the book, I had in mind this painting as the cover. The publishers folks went ahead and did the rest of the work and gave us what I think is a really excellent cover for the book. We cover the 11, as we say, the 11 fateful days after Gettysburg, July 4th to the 14th, from beginning with the day after the battle, July 4th, and continuing on through the day, the 14th, when Lee recrossed the Potomac successfully and got the vast majority of his army back into the safety of, for a little while, West Virginia, and then back into Virginia. And the war would continue after Gettysburg and after the successful retreat conducted by Lee's Army in Northern Virginia. Robert E. Lee made the determination after the failure of the Pickett-Pettigrew assault, known as Pickett's Charge, that when that failed, based on a number of factors, many of them logistics factors, that he would not be able to conduct any more offensive operations at Gettysburg, and he needed to withdraw his army, or as much as he could of it, from the fields at Gettysburg back to the safety of Virginia, which meant a long and arduous march south to get to Hagerstown and then his crossing points at Williamsport and a pontoon bridge at Falling Waters. So he made the determination, although neither side knew that the battle was actually over on the 4th of July. So the following day, which was the 4th, Lee would begin preparations. He pulled his army back, consolidated his lines, and directed a number of his subordinate commanders to prepare the trains and the troops for a withdrawal of the army via basically two main roads, which I say main roads, but at the time they turned out to be less than good roads. Part of the trek from Gettysburg down to the Potomac was very arduous. It was made during rain, lousy road conditions, and considering the number of wagons Lee had with supplies he had acquired and even more wagons carrying his wounded that he felt would be able to survive the trip back down, he had thousands of wounded with him that comprised a great number of his trains. There are differences in the statuses of the two commanders that we note during the course of the book. Lee was basically independent. He was able to make his own decisions, give his orders, and have them carried out without any interference from any superior officer or civilian. that would have been Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, who was also the commander-in-chief of the Confederate forces. But he had no comms link that would take any short amount of time. There's no telegraph line, and couriers would take a long time to get to Lee's army from Richmond. So Lee was basically acting up independently, making his own decisions with no interference or advice, if you will, from Richmond. And of course, Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy, was Lee's immediate superior. And we noted throughout the course of the book that the information, intelligence, news from the battlefield at Gettysburg took a long time to reach the South. So they were operating or assuming the best, but really not knowing what was going on at Gettysburg. They were receiving, the newspapers would get reports, but they wouldn't show up for a number of days in the South. So basically, Davis and the administration, the Confederacy in Richmond, were very much ignorant of what had happened with Lee and his army. They knew a battle was being fought. They didn't know how long it was had lasted, what the casualties were, and initial reports would be favorable, and the final reports, of course, would indicate that Lee's army had been defeated at Gettysburg. But at the time, the entire time this book covers, the folks in the Confederacy, to include the administration of the Confederate government, were ignorant and did not know what was happening with Lee's army. Now, on the other side of the line, the situation was immensely different. This is General George Gordon Meade, who commanded the Army of the Potomac. He commanded the army during the 3-day battle at Gettysburg, and he would continue to command the army during whatever action he would determine would be taken when he was satisfied that Lee was indeed beginning a retreat on the 4th. Meade certainly anticipated the possibility of further action. He would not take any offensive action. He would conduct or have conducted a number of very small reconnaissances, which would determine that Lee had evacuated the town of Gettysburg and had consolidated his lines. And via signal corps stations, especially the one on Little Round Top, they would keep him informed that Confederates were indeed moving, and they apparently were moving in strength and with a considerable number of trains, wagons of all sorts, many of which had been acquired on the trip north, and some of them had been acquired by Jeb Stuart when he was forced to move around the Union Army. Before he could get back to General Lee, he had captured a Union wagon train, and some of those wagons would be used to convey captured supplies as well as wounded Confederate officers and men. Meade, of course, did not have the luxury of being on his own in command. He would have the influence and the guidance, if you will, from the administration in Washington. Meade did maintain communications after the Battle of Gettysburg with General Halleck and his immediate superior in Washington, and of course, President Lincoln, who was very concerned about what was happening at Gettysburg, and certainly he was very concerned about what would happen after the Battle of Gettysburg. This is General Halleck. He was the general-in-chief of the Union armies, known to a number of his folks that knew him. He was referred to as Old Brains. He was the intellectual desk general. President Lincoln considered him to be the best strategist and the best desk-bound commander, if you will. His field time was very limited and not necessarily successful. He had actually commanded General Grant for a time in some of the Western armies. So General Halleck would not be a big help to General Meade, because Halleck would sympathize with Meade to some extent, but he would also have to follow the instructions of Abraham Lincoln, who literally demanded that Meade conduct an aggressive pursuit and bring Lee's badly damaged army back to battle at some point before Lee could cross the Potomac. And as nature intervened and a small group of Union cavalry on the 4th of July would intervene, this, which would not seem to have been possible with the Confederates in retreat by a direct route, and Meade and his generals made the determination on the 4th at a council of war, which became a very sticky point for the administration when Meade held a number of councils of war at Gettysburg and after Gettysburg. Councils of war, of course, to talk about whether a council of war you should have one or you shouldn't. Halleck would later tell Meade that do not call councils of war, make your generals fight and do what you want them to do. So the next step and at top of the chain of command was President Abraham Lincoln, who had seen an opportunity based on what he was hearing from Gettysburg, from General Meade's reports that were coming to Washington. There was much better communication between Washington, D.C. and Meade's army than there was between Richmond and Meade's army. President Lincoln saw Gettysburg as an opportunity, the beginning of possibly the end. And the reports of what had happened to General Meade's army gave Lincoln the confidence that if General Meade, who apparently was the right general finally to command the Army of the Potomac, that General Meade, if he would aggressively pursue and engage Lee again, the possibility was there that the war would end, or at least that Meade could deal another serious blow to Lee's army. Because obviously Lee's army was still intact, though badly damaged. It had not been destroyed, which was Meade's primary mission. His primary order from Washington was to destroy Lee's army, with the secondary mission of protecting Washington and Baltimore. So President Lincoln was very hopeful that the war might actually be terminated or shortened because of the results of the Battle of Gettysburg and what he hoped would be the results of another engagement from Meade being able to pursue and engage Lee before Lee could get across the Potomac River. During the course of the retreat, especially in the early days, the weather would be a primary factor in Lee's retreat, Meade's pursuit, and the ability of Meade to actually have the time and the opportunity to engage Lee again north of the Potomac. The river, the Potomac, rose very much. It rose very high, and it became unfordable at Williamsport, which had been the primary ford that had been used by the Confederate Army in their march north. And I mentioned Union cavalry. On the 4th of July, a cavalry detachment acting from Frederick, Maryland, under the command of General French, one of his cavalry assets, partially destroyed Lee's pontoon bridge at Falling Waters, which is a little ways from Williamsport. And that was the only means that Lee would have of getting wagons, artillery, any conveyance, including manpower, because they could no longer ford at Williamsport. So the weather had conspired against General Lee and acted in favor of the Union cause. And the river, Meade, of course, knew this, that the river had risen too high for Lee to have his men ford, and all he had available at Williamsport were a couple of barges of a ferry operating at Williamsport, which was a quite lengthy process to get troops and wagons and 5,000 Union POWs who had been captured at Gettysburg, who were not paroled, because that was now not allowed for Union prisoners of war to accept parole. Some did, but roughly 5,000, or a few less than that, were not paroled and were marched south under guard. And they comprised part of the immense amount of wagon trains and men that were marching south, they were going into captivity, as opposed to the Confederates who were marching back to the safety of Virginia. So Lee consolidated his position prior to getting his retreat started. he would have to send his wounded and any supplies that had been acquired that they would take with them. And there was an immense amount of supplies, not necessarily food and certainly not water, which they were running short of at Gettysburg, believe it or not. They had lived off the land, but they had been confined to the battlefield area, so they could not move out and forage as much as they had during the campaign as they moved north. So on the 4th, Lee would begin his retreat back to the safety of the Potomac and south of the Potomac, and trying to get back into Virginia. One of the primary officers entrusted with the conveyance, the trains of wounded Confederates, somewhere around 10,000, possibly more, possibly less, who were judged that they could make the journey. There were a number of thousand Confederate wounded who were so seriously wounded they would have to be left at Gettysburg to the care of the Union Army and Union medical personnel. General Imboden, who commanded a Northwest brigade of somewhat irregular cavalry, not the regulars that you think of when you think of Jeb Stuart and his men, Imboden was entrusted with a wagon train, one of the trains of the wounded, which would be 17 miles in length, to give you an idea of just part of the immense number of trains that were involved in the Confederate retreat. And they would have to go prior to the infantry. You'd have to have the artillery moving, but prior to the infantry disengaging and breaking off of their position at Gettysburg, all the rest of these trains and immense number of wounded men would have to get safely across the Potomac, and then Lee could disengage from bring his. Now, he, of course, was concerned that Meade might take action, any type of action, a number of types, to prevent this escape. It was logical that Meade, who Lee knew outnumbered his men, although Meade always felt that he was outnumbered by Lee's army, that Lee had no illusions that he was outnumbered and he was in bad shape. He was short on ammunition, and any ammunition would be gotten at Williamsport or would have to come across the river. So any train of ammunition which would bring the ordnance that he needed, he would have to go to get it. It was not going to come very far to him. So that was part of the reason. But General Imboden commanded cavalry that would guard one of the many trains carrying Lee's wounded. Union cavalry had partially destroyed the pontoon bridge, so another problem that Lee had was he would have to have his engineers repair the bridge. So that, like everything else, would take time. So while Imboden and his men and all the rest of the Confederates were slowly disengaging and moving south from Gettysburg, Lee would have his engineers working on the rebuilding of the pontoon bridge, plus hoping that the ford at Williamsport would soon be operational, that the river would recede enough so that Lee could begin to move troops across by fording at Williamsport. Now, one of the assets that General Meade had available was he had a very good intelligence organization. It was new, it was very revolutionary in terms of intelligence gathering or information gathering. It was known as the Bureau of Military Information, and it was led by Colonel George Sharp, who you see on the slide. He had been a colonel commanding the 120th New York, but he was assigned the duty of commanding this Bureau of Military Information, which comprised a number of individuals, and they provided General Hooker initially. Hooker preceded Meade as the commander of the Army of the Potomac and was relieved by President Lincoln just before the battle and replaced by General Meade. Colonel Sharp had scouts who operated behind Confederate lines. He had individuals that would interview and debrief, if you will, Confederate prisoners of war, whether they were captured or deserters. He would take cavalry intelligence gathered by General Pleasanton's troopers, analyze them, and see whether they were accurate or whether the numbers they were talking about or the information they had could be confirmed by other sources. We would later refer to that as all source intelligence. The more sources you have, the better your information is going to be. The intelligence you get, if you have 5 sources and 3 of them agree, then that is a lot better than only going with 1 or 2. It would take General Meade some time to get used to the information that was coming from the BMI, simply because this was new and Meade had not been very familiar with the BMI. And unfortunately, he didn't really trust what he was hearing from them. Meade was getting other numbers that gave Lee a significant advantage in manpower, which would allow Meade to operate very cautiously and very slowly and very deliberately, as opposed to the information that the BMI and other sources were providing that said that Lee's army was much smaller than General Meade's, and they were actually talking to wounded Confederates and finding out exactly how much damage had been done to Lee's army. You could probably have gotten a pretty good idea of the damage done to the Army of Northern Virginia by just going out and looking at the fields of battle, the debris of war, and the dead and seriously wounded Confederates that were in Confederate field hospitals and were also in Union field hospitals. But from the outskirts of Harrisburg, he pulled them back down on the beginning on the 28th and 29th, and would concentrate the army in the Gettysburg and Cashtown area in preparation for what Lee expected to be a battle, which unexpectedly by both sides began and continued at the little town of Gettysburg. Stuart's cavalry would perform, he would make up for any differences or any bad reports or ill thought of how he had performed at Gettysburg and before. His cavalry would perform admirably during the retreat, during Lee's retreat, screening and preventing Union cavalry from gaining too much of an advantage or gaining information. So Stuart would make up for his deficiencies at Gettysburg during the course of the retreat. His troopers would prevent Union cavalry from doing more damage, and basically all they were able to accomplish was the capture of a few of Lee's wagons, some of which contained supplies, many of which contained Confederate wounded who were hoping that they could get back south of the river. So while Stuart is helping to cover the Confederate retreat, General Meade is somewhat conflicted about exactly what Lee is doing. Is Lee retreating? Basically, the information coming to Meade was that Lee was in full retreat. And even in Washington, D.C., General Haupt and various officials in Washington were saying that Lee was in fact in retreat. So Meade, making a decision that Lee probably was retreating, he sent the entire 6th Corps, which was commanded by the officer you see on the screen, Major General John Sedgwick. He sent the 6th Corps on a reconnaissance in pursuit of Lee's rear guard with orders to pursue and to follow, but not to engage. One of the interesting aspects, which we discuss, is that Sedgwick was told he should not bring his ordnance trains with him, which meant that the only ammunition that the 6th Corps would have available would be that carried by the infantrymen in the 6th Corps. And that was primarily done so that Sedgwick would not be inclined to get into a fight because he did not have enough ammunition other than what was being carried by his troops. His primary function was just to follow and verify for Meade that General Lee was in fact in retreat, that he wasn't trying to pull some kind of stunt and do a flanking movement, because despite the losses that were obvious to General Meade that Lee's army had suffered, Meade was very concerned that Lee, being Lee, who he had seen win so many battles previously, that he was concerned that Lee might try something So he wanted to be very, very certain. So that is why he had Sedgwick on a reconnaissance with roughly 14,000 troops, just for the purpose of following to ensure that Lee was in fact retreating. But he was not to engage Lee's rear guard. Now on the 5th of July, as the Union Army is very slowly beginning to unwind, and the decision had been made on the evening of the 4th by Meade and his subordinate commanders that they would pursue Lee by a parallel path, meaning that they would follow him, but they would keep the army between Washington and Lee, and they would follow on a series of roads, better roads, moving parallel, but also having to move farther than Lee's army, which was on a direct route. So in addition to trying to catch Lee, he would have to move farther and faster. So Meade would have to put his infantry, and they would have to do some very hard and very long marching in very bad weather in order to be able to have a chance to catch up with Lee before Lee would be able to cross and before his bridge could be rebuilt. Of course, Meade was aware of the fact that the pontoon bridge had been destroyed, and he was aware of the fact that the river was too high for Lee's men to ford at Williamsport. Now, one event that took place on the 5th was a meeting between General Herman Haupt and military railroads, an old West Point classmate of General Meade. Haupt traveled to Gettysburg on the 5th to coordinate the movement of the railroads in moving supplies and that to the Army of the Potomac, verifying and making sure his people repaired any railroad track that was damaged, any bridges that were damaged or destroyed. And Haupt was also very concerned. In his mind, he did not see that Meade was moving fast enough to be able to catch up with Lee and engage him before Lee would cross. So Haupt, being a bit of an engineer, he had discussed when he met up with Meade, he talked to Meade at his headquarters, and Meade said, well, Lee's in bad shape, he's got to march a long way, and his bridge has been destroyed. And Haupt said he spoke very frankly with his old classmate, and he said that Lee has very capable engineers, and he can have the bridge repaired in a very short amount of time. And Haupt's biggest fear was that Meade was taking his time, and he was being too hesitant, and he was not moving immediately to get his army on the road and in pursuit of Lee. Haupt was also very familiar with the area, so he knew how long it would take to get from various points from Gettysburg out in the Williamsport and Hagerstown area. And he was very concerned, and he urged that Meade immediately pursue Lee, which was something that Meade was just not ready to do. He said his troops needed to be rested, which really wasn't true, and that he simply was taking his time to get his men ready to conduct any type of a pursuit of Lee. And basically, Meade was considering more of a following, what he would say would be to drive Lee out, as opposed to actually looking for another engagement. He was looking more to make sure that Lee didn't pull any funny business, and that Lee did retreat, and that Lee did do what it looked like he was doing, which was in full retreat. So, in fact, General Haupt would go back to Washington later that day. He would go to meet with General Halleck and the president and tell them what he had seen, and in his opinion, that Meade was not moving fast enough to be able to catch up with Lee and bring him to battle again. And Halleck would react to that and encourage Meade to move as fast as possible. And during the course of the entire 11 days, Meade would tell his superiors, General Halleck and the president, that he was moving as fast as he could. He anticipated another battle. And he would also tell his chief confidant, and who happened to be his wife, in a series of letters that he wrote, that he intended to engage Lee again. He would prefer to fight him north of the river rather than have to chase him in Virginia, in Lee's home ground. So everything that Meade was telling his superiors, as well as his wife, indicated that his intent was to pursue and was to bring battle with Lee again. But it just didn't appear that that was actually happening. In the meantime, Meade's cavalry under General Pleasanton was ordered to harass the Confederate trains as opposed to move down, cross at some point. Meade did have the ability to have pontoon bridges of his own put up wherever he wanted to. He had the ability to cross cavalry and other troops to see if they could move ahead and cut off Lee's escape. That certainly was an option, but it doesn't appear, we didn't find any evidence that Meade had considered that seriously, although he would refer to it in his testimony before the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War in March of 1864. He hesitated. He did not have any bridges repaired at Harper's Ferry, which was possible, or he had pontoon bridges ready to be built, but he never gave the orders until after Lee's retreat to have those bridges built. He would have a bridge rebuilt, and the bridges would be, the pontoon bridges would be built, but after Lee had in fact crossed the Potomac again. Finally, beginning primarily on the 6th of July, the Union Army began its movement. And it wasn't necessarily, as I said, in direct pursuit. They would move, sometimes they would just move east and then start south when they would get to the roads that they would follow on a parallel course to Lee's army. And this would all take time. And it took a lot of time, valuable time, for Meade to disengage his forces from Gettysburg, from the battlefield, and begin his move to drive Lee out of Northern territory or Northern soil, which would be something that would upset President Lincoln, and who would say, it's all our soil. Lincoln wanted to see Lee's army destroyed, and Meade apparently was looking to protect Washington and Baltimore and just make sure that Lee didn't try anything, but not interfere that much with his retreat. So finally, the 6th Corps is recalled from its reconnaissance, and the army begins its slow pursuit of Lee's army. This gentleman is General Daniel Butterfield. If you're familiar with Gettysburg, you're familiar with Butterfield. He was the chief of staff under General Hooker, had been a corps commander. In fact, General Meade had taken the 5th Corps, command of the 5th Corps from Butterfield, because Meade was in fact senior to Butterfield, and there was a bit of a squabble about that between Meade and Hooker, and Butterfield would become Hooker's chief of staff. When General Meade relieved General Hooker of command, he requested Butterfield to stay on. And that's simply because Meade was not familiar with the entire army, and Butterfield was. He probably had the best handle, other than General Williams or General Hooker himself, who was out of the picture now, as to the locations and the status and how the army operated, which Meade was not familiar with. So Meade wisely, and there's a lot of controversy about Butterfield's role at Gettysburg, but Meade requested Butterfield to stay on, and he did. Butterfield was hit by a piece of a spent shell on the 3rd during the cannonade preceding Pickett and Pettigrew's assault, and this apparently caused a significant contusion. It didn't pierce the skin, but General Meade, in fact, in a letter to Butterfield, said he was concerned that Butterfield had suffered some kind of internal injuries from the shock of this piece of shell hitting him. So Butterfield continued on up until the 6th, when he felt that he could no longer function as chief of staff. And by this time, Meade had Meade, throughout the period, indicated that he was very grateful for Butterfield's services. And it wasn't until after Butterfield's testimony and Butterfield's association with General Hooker and General Dan Sickles, who commanded the Union Third Corps at Gettysburg until he was wounded on the second day, that Lee became very apprehensive and began to dislike General Butterfield based on what Butterfield had testified. So with Butterfield out of the picture, the duties of the chief of staff were now shared by General Warren, who was the chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac and played a pretty significant role during the battle. If you know Gettysburg, you've heard about General Warren on Little Round Top. He shared that duty for just a short amount of time with General Pleasanton, who commanded the Union Cavalry Division, Cavalry Corps at Gettysburg and during the pursuit. Pleasanton was not that good an officer in terms of acquiring information to keep, which is something that Meade kept talking about, that he didn't have enough information. He wasn't sure of what Lee was doing. And one of Pleasanton's primary responsibilities was to get information to provide to General Meade. Pleasanton was wanted to get into cavalry fights, and it was probably his orders that caused the cavalry to harass Lee's trains and cause whatever damage they could, as long as they could get past Stuart and his cavalrymen. So we move on to the next day, and on the 6th, General Buford, who commanded the 1st Cavalry Division under General Pleasanton, he was ordered to seize the town of Williamsport, Maryland, which was the location of the ford and the ferry operation that was ongoing, and which would be one of the focal points of Lee's defensive position after he would evacuate the Hagerstown area, which is where he moved his troops to first. General Buford would attempt to occupy Williamsport. Unfortunately for Buford, he was not able to capture the town. The Confederate trains under Imboden had begun to arrive at Williamsport, and you had a huge number of wagons forming up in the low ground just before the river, waiting for transportation to get across. A lot of wagons, and they were more arriving all the time. So General Imboden organized a defensive position. He organized a defense made up primarily of his troopers and a good number of wounded Confederate officers and enlisted men and NCOs who had reached Williamsport but were actually capable of fighting. So they organized, and a number of the Teamsters and the Wagoneers who were employed, who were working for Lee's army, and it was known actually at some corners as the Wagoneers fight. They prevented Buford from getting into Williamsport. They repulsed his attacks and kept Williamsport in Confederate hands. So that was a critical point in the early part of the retreat, was Buford with 3 brigades who had been engaged at Gettysburg, and him and his troopers were pretty worn. They didn't fight after the first day, but they were operating, their horses were basically worn out, and they had been on the go and covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. But Buford's troopers were simply unable to break through the improvised Confederate line, and he would withdraw from the Williamsport area and await the arrival of Meade's infantry. Now the ferry was still operating. You had 5,000 POWs who were occasionally, on a number of occasions, offered paroles but did not accept it because they knew they would be a burden, and they also were expecting to be rescued. We included a number of accounts in the book from federal POWs who were anticipating Union cavalry to swoop down and rescue them at any point on the retreat, especially prior to reaching the Potomac. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And there was fighting on the 6th at Monterey Pass, which was a very narrow gap in the mountains, and the Confederates successfully prevented the Union from occupying that pass and to allow Confederate trains and troops and that to continue with that aspect, that part of the retreat. So General Buford was repulsed. It was one of the few offensive actions, serious offensive actions that took place during the pursuit, during the retreat. And unfortunately, it was Buford by himself. He didn't even have cavalry support from General Kilpatrick. And there was certainly no infantry anywhere around that could support Buford. So then we end the 6th of July and we move on to the 7th. And there is a Library of Congress look at what would become our cover, which took place, which was drawn based on Forbes' view of the Army of the Potomac's pursuit. He was with the Army, and he painted this based on his recollection and his knowledge of the pursuit at about the time, about the 7th or the 8th or the 9th. Those days, the Union Army was marching, and they were marching very well and very long in pursuit in order to catch up to Lee's army because they would have to go farther. You get a good idea of the condition, how wet it was and how it was, and simply the roads with those many troops and artillery pieces, the roads that both sides were moving on would be less than adequate, and it would be a certain burden on both sides attempting to get to the safety of Williamsport for Lee and get to be able to attack Lee's army, if possible, at Williamsport. During this period of time, which would be the next few days, and actually all the way through the retreat, and even after Lee crossed, Meade would be reinforced. During the course of the book, we provide information on the numbers of troops that would be sent to Meade's army. Now, Meade wasn't necessarily happy about this because a lot of those troops were militia. They were raw. They were just barely recruited. They were not good at marching. They were not good at combat, but they were volunteers and they were all that was available. There were some regular troops, some seasoned troops that were sent and would join the Union Army. But while Lee was receiving no reinforcements whatsoever, Meade was being reinforced. Now, he would not acknowledge, did not like to acknowledge their presence, and they would often be used to guard facilities in Meade's rear, such as his base at Frederick. And very few of those units, some were incorporated into the 3rd Corps, and various other units would be assigned to the active, the 7th Infantry Corps. But Meade was being reinforced, and we're talking over 10,000 troops. And even though they were militia, if the militia troops had been assigned with veterans, they probably would have fought very well because some of those similar troops had fought at Gettysburg and had fought well. And that was their first fight. And they were 9-month units, Stannard's brigade of Vermonters, the 151st Pennsylvania and the 1st Corps were just a couple of those units that fought well. So Meade did have the reinforcements, but they didn't meet his requirements. So he was loath to include them in his army. He did not want the impression that he overwhelmed Lee when he didn't feel that the troops that he was adding were adequate to meet his requirements as seasoned veterans. Halleck, throughout this time period, was trying everything he could to get anybody to reinforce Meade. They were being sent to Harper's Ferry, where they would be routed to join Meade's army. To give you an example, on the 4th of July, the infantry strength, that's the primary combat arm, the infantry strength of the Army of Potomac was listed as being 52,327, which was significantly less than what fought at Gettysburg. And there's no doubt that Meade's army had suffered at Gettysburg. So it was 52,327. On the 14th of July, the day that Lee crossed the Potomac, the Army infantry strength was 67,645. So he had gained another roughly 15,000 troops. And in contrast to that, according to documents, according to data from the Army of Northern Virginia and General, at the time of Gettysburg, Major Walter Taylor, who was on Lee's staff, based on War Department data that Taylor looked at, Lee's strength, his infantry strength at Williamsport on the 20th, or at the 20th of July, which is as close to Williamsport as we can get, it's close to the 14th, Lee's army had 36,535 infantrymen. And those men were required to cover a defensive line that was 9 to 10 miles long. So you can imagine the few amount of troops per yard or per feet in that defensive line, which would include artillery, and it also included cavalry. And it's not really a wise decision to put cavalry in a defensive position because they're not armed as well as infantry, and their purpose is for reconnaissance and screening. But Stuart's cavalry did occupy a part of Lee's 9-mile, 10-mile long line, which was not that great a line as it was. After General Warren and General Pleasanton, they had the duties of Chief of Staff. On the 8th of July, General Andrew Atkinson Humphreys, Major General, newly promoted Major General Humphreys, would accept the position of Chief of Staff. He had been a division commander in the 3rd Corps at Gettysburg. He was a good friend of Meade's. He would now become Meade's Chief of Staff. Meade had wanted Humphreys as Chief of Staff, and Humphreys had not wanted to be Chief of Staff. But finally, on the 8th, Humphreys would accept the position of Chief of Staff in the Army of the Potomac. During this time, there was more marching for the Army of the Potomac. A number of the regiments would report marching by a spy that was hanged, who had been a sutler operating for the Union Army, that he had hanged, and a number of regiments had seen him. He was hanged by Buford's troopers. And Lee was moving into position with his combat elements, his infantry and artillery, into the area around Hagerstown. Not directly to Williamsport, but Hagerstown, although all the wagon trains were converging on Williamsport because that's where they would cross, or from there they would move down once the pontoon bridge was completed to Falling Waters. So we move ahead to the 9th of July, which involved more marching, and they were marching, the Union Army was marching very well, and the Confederates were beginning to take into positions around the Hagerstown area. And on the 9th, Meade made his final appointment of corps commanders to replace those who were lost at Gettysburg. He would select Major General William French to command the 3rd Corps, which had been commanded by General Sickles at Gettysburg and General Birney after Sickles had been wounded. Now, French was appointed to command the 3rd Corps. French had been with the Army of the Potomac and had moved on to positions, basically administrative positions, and was at Frederick during the battle. French was not a well-liked or well-known or kind of general you would want to be a corps commander. But Meade apparently saw something in him or appointed him as a corps commander. One of 3 that Meade would be able to appoint. General John Newton was appointed on the 1st of July after General Reynolds was killed. He was appointed to take command of the 1st Army Corps, Vice General Abner Doubleday, who Meade did not like at all. And General Newton, who was an engineer like Meade was, a fellow engineer who had been a division commander in the 6th Corps, Meade was a decent general, but again, he was not the kind of general you would want. He was certainly not a General John Reynolds or a Hancock or even a Sickles, who was an aggressive general, if an inexperienced one. So you would have General Newton, not the best choice when Meade certainly could appoint anybody he wanted, and he had some general officers that performed very capably at Gettysburg. But General Newton would command the First Corps during the pursuit and during Lee's retreat. The third commander that General Meade appointed was General William Hayes, who is seen here seated with some of his staff officers. He's basically the one seated in the center of the group. William Hayes apparently showed up at Gettysburg sometime prior to the 3rd of July. He was there. There's virtually nothing, I could find nothing written about Hayes. He was a very lackluster commander and would disappear almost as fast as he appeared. But Meade appointed him to command the Second Corps after General Hancock and then General Gibbon of the Second Corps were both wounded at Gettysburg. So one of the things that's unusual and that we try to point out is that Meade, who could have commanded aggressive officers such as Hancock, such as Reynolds, such as Gibbon, and even Dan Sickles, who was very aggressive, he was well liked by his corps, yet he appointed 3 very, very wishy-washy, if you will, officers to command those 3 corps. And their performance certainly would not be anything to their credit during this time period. And all would disappear by the following spring when Grant and Meade took the Army of the Potomac, when there would be only 3 corps, and none of those officers would command any of those 3 corps. So Hayes now has the Second Corps, Vice Hancock, who Meade mentioned a number of times that he missed Hancock as a corps commander and had told his wife he needed corps commanders, yet those he appointed were less than stellar in their military capabilities. Meanwhile, General Lee, of course, is waiting for the Potomac to recede and the bridge to be repaired, the Pontoon Bridge to repair. So he had no choice but to begin forming a defensive position at and around Williamsport. And this is a Forbes painting of some of the Confederate, how he saw the Confederate, part of the Confederate lines being formed at around Williamsport, and in that area, Hagerstown to Williamsport to Falling Waters. And there is significant debate about the strength of the Confederate line. General Meade and his senior officers said it was a very strong line, and General Warren and a lot of regimental histories refer to the fact that they were basically thrown together lines. They were a few logs, a few trees that were felled and thrown together, and that the Confederates were often low on ammunition. And even Colonel Alexander, who was part of the group that formed this line, said it was a kind of a patched together line of various good, bad, and in between. So Alexander said that it was a decent line, but it wasn't a good line. It wasn't that capable of repelling an attack, because he said Meade should have taken a chance and attacked his line. So you had Meade struggling and beginning to catch up because Lee couldn't move faster than a few ferry boats could move his trains and his prisoners of war, and then begin to move his troops across the Potomac. He simply needed all of his combat troops to be in this line until he could get everybody else across. And then when the bridge was completed and the river fell, then he could contemplate actually withdrawing and disengaging from his line at Williamsport. On the 10th, sometime on the 9th, and then related to his wife on the 10th, General Meade made the decision that up until that day, up until the 9th, General Lee was trying to get across the river as fast as he could. He said that point blank to his wife. Apparently, data from a captured deserter, his report, what he had told his captors, led Meade to decide that Lee was not intending to cross the river. Lee was going to stay in place and wait to be attacked, which was the one thing General Meade did not want to do, which was attack General Lee in a defensive position of Lee's choice. He just did not want to do that. He had seen what had happened on the other side of the dice when General Lee attacked his force in a defensive position, and it wasn't that well entrenched, but Meade's army had repelled Lee, and Lee had suffered serious losses. Meade did not want to repeat that. He simply was not about to bring himself to assume an offensive posture. So what Meade would do as his troops were arriving, he would form his own defensive position just outside, just beyond Lee's position, in anticipation of possibly being attacked by General Lee. This was a very real concern of Meade, and he would have his troops digging in a position that probably was better than Lee's line and would be shorter than Lee's line, similar to what the roles were, but reversed at Gettysburg. So by the 11th of July, General Meade would begin moving his army into position, basically a defensive position, but moving his line in opposite General Lee's line that he was forming. But at the time, Meade had made the decision that Lee was not intending to, he was going to for Meade to attack him, which Meade was not about to do. But Meade wasn't, oh, my internet is unstable. Now I guess it's all right. If anything, if something goes wrong, please let me know if you're not getting this. But Meade was not actually telling his superiors that this was the case. He told his wife, but he did not tell General Halleck that Lee was not intending to attack or was not intending to retreat across the river. He gave the impression to Halleck and Lincoln that he was going to act aggressively and attack Lee's position at Williamsport. And here we see President Lincoln and his two secretaries, John Nicolay and John Hay. And John Hay, in his diary, reported that on the 11th of July, General Meade informed Washington that he would attack the following day, which was the 12th. And this was in a diary from one of the secretaries of President Lincoln. Hay was somewhat skeptical, and his reasoning was that Meade probably won't attack because he's an engineer. So whatever reasoning Hay had, engineers apparently were not good in offensive operations. So Washington had received word, at least somewhere in the White House, that Meade intended to attack on the 12th. In the meantime, Meade had his signal officers observing Confederate positions. And here is a Alfred Wout drawing of Union signal officer probably in the attic of a home with a telescope observing the Confederate positions. Confederate positions were not easily observed in the terrain around Williamsport. So they utilized any high ground they could find. But this is a drawing of the Signal Corps, who was very active during the retreat and during Meade's pursuit following, whatever you want to call it, of Lee's army. Signal Corps provided Meade with a lot of information from various signal positions and signal sites. In the book, we include a map of the various signal stations that were utilized by the Union Signal Corps personnel during the course of the campaign during those 11 days. During the 12th of July, the following day, obviously Meade did not attack. President Lincoln was anxiously waiting in the telegraph office at the White House for a word from General Meade on how the attack had come off, what had happened, and he did not get that report. That attack did not happen. Interestingly, a number of Union accounts, regimental accounts, and one from the autobiography of a general officer, General de Trobriand, who was a brigade commander in the Third Corps, they reported that there was indeed an order from General Meade for the Army to attack on the 12th. And the orders were read to the troops. At least a number of Third Corps regiments reported that they were orders that they would attack Lee's army on the 12th. And for whatever reason, Meade decided against it. There was some fighting took place, and Meade's reasoning of why he called off the attack or why he did not attack is unknown. He never related it. He never even related that there was a fight. One interesting aspect, side aspect of this was General Meade, during an inspection or during his riding along the lines, came across the 118th Pennsylvania of the 5th Corps. And General Meade got into a discussion with the chaplain of the 118th Pennsylvania, which was known as the Corn Exchange Regiment. And the chaplain was actually kind of scolding Meade for fighting on the Sabbath. The 12th was a Sunday. And so there was an interesting account recorded by a captain in the 118th Pennsylvania of the discussion that went on between General Meade, who was saying, hey, military operations don't really care what day it is, and the chaplain, who was saying, this is the Sabbath, it's Sunday, you shouldn't really be doing this, General. So that was just an interesting side piece of what happened when the attack did not happen on the 12th. There was a little bit of movement. Union troops shifted positions. They would move almost every day into a better position, whatever. So nothing happened in terms of an attack by Meade's army. Meade, here's another view of General Meade. On the 12th, the day when supposedly there could be a very critical day in American history, certainly in the war in the East, Meade wrote a letter to his wife on the 12th, a short letter, only 2 pages. And he explained that he was waiting for something to happen, and it appeared that something would be happening. And then he went into an interesting discussion, and he complained to his wife that he had received eyeglasses instead of spectacles. He had ordered spectacles, and you can see on the left side, if you're looking at from where you're looking at, you can see a pair of spectacles protruding from the side of the edge of Meade's uniform. And he was complaining to his wife on a critical day in American history, what could have been, that he had received eyeglasses instead of spectacles. And he had ordered spectacles. And he even went so far as to describe who he was getting them from and what the serial number or what the model number of the spectacles he had ordered, what that was, which is kind of why I chose this picture to put in the show, that those are the spectacles that Meade had expected and had not received. So on a very critical, could have been a very critical day in the history of our country, certainly the Army of Potomac, Army in Northern Virginia, General Meade is complaining to his wife about not receiving the spectacles he ordered. Somewhat unusual. General Meade would make the determination that he would attack. Finally, he was going to attack on the 12th unless something intervened to prevent it. He sent a message to Halleck late in the afternoon. Well, what happened, what intervened was actually General Meade intervened with himself. He called a council of war that evening around 8:00 p.m. And he presented the situation to his subordinate commanders, his corps commanders, and gave his analysis of the situation. Basically, Lee is in a strong position, and we haven't really conducted the reconnaissance we should, which wasn't true because they had spent the last 2 days reconnoitering and taking a look at what they could see of the Confederate lines. And Meade was able to present the impression that he was willing to, he wanted to attack. His orders were to attack. He was willing to attack, but he would not do so unless his subordinate commanders voted in favor of an attack. Well, as you probably realize and know, they voted against it. His corps commanders voted against attacking. The only two corps commanders voting in favor, there were three actually, three commanders voted in favor of the attack. General Wadsworth, who was representing the First Corps since General Newton was ill at the time, General Howard, who commanded the 11th Corps, and General Pleasanton, who commanded the Cavalry Corps. The other corps commanders voted against it. Now, interestingly enough, General Warren, who did not have a vote, he had spoken in favor of attacking. And he would later say, if he was asked what would have happened if they had attacked, and he said, if we had attacked, we would have cut right through them. And General Humphreys, who was the chief of staff, who was a veteran and experienced commander, he said he was in favor of attacking. But General Humphreys, the chief of staff, he did not have a vote either. General Hunt, who commanded the artillery, who was basically played no role in this time period. During this time, there was no shelling of the Confederate lines, nothing of the sort. General Hunt indicated that he had favored an attack, or also that the Army tried it, that Meade moved troops around to cut off Lee's retreat. So if you look at the numbers of generals, important generals, and Meade said he favored an attack, but he didn't vote either. He was only the general commanding the Army, so, but he did not vote. So you actually had more significant officers voting or believing in an attack should have taken place, but Meade went with the opinions, the votes of his subordinate infantry commanders, and decided that he would conduct more reconnaissance the following day. So we come to the next day, which is the 13th, and General Meade waited until late in the afternoon before he informed General Halleck that he had in fact not attacked, that he felt that he needed to conduct more reconnaissance based on the results of a council of war. Well, General Halleck finally got a little bit irritated and told General Meade that do not call councils of war, too late for that councils never fight, and that he should make his generals obey his orders. If Meade had felt he should attack, he should have had his generals, ordered his generals to attack, and they would have attacked. So Meade informs General Halleck that he tells him that he didn't attack. What he will do and what he orders for the following day, the 14th, was he would conduct a reconnaissance in force of 4 divisions of the Army. Well, 4 divisions was a very small number, considering every corps except one had 3 divisions in it, and only 4 corps were going to send 1 division each on a reconnaissance in force to get a better look at the Confederate line, because Meade, conducting a personal reconnaissance on the 13th, had really seen nothing. He had not been able to make out any, had not been able to gather any information. He had not found any place where he thought the Confederate line was weak, what he could see. So he orders a reconnaissance in force for the following day by only 4 divisions of the Army. And there was no overall commander of this reconnaissance in force, and they would simply advance that division, take a look at what they could see of the Confederate line, and then inform headquarters what they had observed. They were not ordered to attack. They were not ordered to probe or make a feint or be aggressive, or he could push in, they could push in the skirmishers in order to get a better view, but he was not attacking. Later, Meade would give the impression in his report and his testimony that he had moved the Army forward in an attack, which had not taken place. It did not happen. In the meantime, that evening, the 13th, Lee's engineers have completed the repair of the pontoon bridge. The Potomac River has receded enough for Williamsport to be fordable. So Lee now has his bridge completed. He can march troops, they can ford the river, and he will be able to withdraw his army, which he determined to do. General Meade General Lee, certainly being an aggressive general, would have liked the chance to repel an attack, but he was very concerned about the length of his line, the condition of his army, getting his wounded away and successfully withdrawing. So there was no hesitation on Lee's part. If the river had been fordable, if the bridge had not been destroyed, he would have crossed the river as soon as possible. And it was now possible. The evening of the 13th, he began moving his troops into position and began crossing his combat forces, sending them back across the Potomac. General Stuart's cavalry was ordered to assume the infantry positions to prevent General Meade's troops from learning or from observing that the Confederates were in effect actually be starting their retreat, because an army is very vulnerable when it is retreating or trying to cross a river. And so Stuart's cavalry would occupy those positions and cover the rear guard, the infantry rear guard, and they were supposed to cross last. And this is a view of the crossing point of Lee's army, again, drawn by Forbes. So Lee begins his retreat the evening of the 13th, and it continues on into the morning hours of the 14th. In the meantime, the reconnaissance in force begins, and the cavalry under General Kilpatrick and General Buford are also moving forward to see what they can see. And the advances of the reconnaissance and the cavalry is no longer occupying its line. They have left. And finally, orders go out to the Army of the Potomac for the units, for the infantry, to begin a pursuit, to begin following, to begin moving against Lee, to find out where he is, what's going on, to pursue him and to engage him. But it's too little and it's too late. There was some cavalry fighting at Falling Waters, fight between General Custer's, a couple of General Custer's regiments, the 6th Michigan primarily, and the Confederate rear guard under General Pettigrew. According to General Longstreet, Stuart's troopers were supposed to assume position covering the rear guard, covering Pettigrew's men, but they went ahead and crossed the river instead. So Pettigrew's rear guard was kind of surprised by Federal cavalry, and General Pettigrew himself was mortally wounded in that engagement at Falling Waters. But a considerable number of Custer's troopers, especially the 6th Michigan, were also killed and wounded, and it did nothing to prevent the rear guard of Lee's army from crossing. And this is a drawing of some of the fighting between the Union cavalry and Lee's rear guard at Falling Waters. So in the meantime, the Union advance finally gets into Williamsport and finds out that Lee's army is gone. They cut the pontoon bridge late. They cut the bridge off, so it floats down the river, and Lee has gotten the majority of his troops, wounded, prisoners, across the river unimpeded by Meade's forces. The next thing that Meade does is he sends a message to General Halleck saying that Lee has crossed the river. I went in pursuit and I launched my attack, and I found that Lee had abandoned his position, and he asked Halleck for orders. And Halleck related somewhat angrily that Meade is to cross the river, pursue Lee, and cut him to pieces. And that did not happen. The 1st Union Infantry would not cross the Potomac on a bridge that finally was built until the 17th of July, 3 full days after Lee completed his crossing. General Halleck informed General Meade of the president's dissatisfaction with what had happened. Lincoln had expected another engagement. He had expected the best. He felt that Meade could have engaged, should have engaged Lee, and possibly, probably defeated him north of the river. And now Lee was safely back with his army across, and those hopes had evaporated. Based on Halleck's relating Lincoln's disappointment, Meade asked to be relieved of his command. That request was denied, and Meade would go on to command the army through the rest of the 1863 and through the rest of the war. He would still operate in command of the Army of the Potomac, but after the spring of 1864, he would operate in the shadow of Ulysses Grant, who was brought east to command all the Union armies and who would fly his headquarters flag with the Army of the Potomac. So Meade would kind of act as more of a chief of staff than the army commander operating under Grant's command. On that day that Lee crossed, the 14th, President Lincoln would write a very strong letter to General Meade expressing his disappointment with Meade's conduct of the pursuit, excuse me, saying that he had expected that Meade could have engaged, could have beaten Lee's army. And apparently, Mr. Lincoln wrote the letter and he vented his frustration on paper with his pen and made the decision not to send the letter to Meade. He put it in an envelope, letter to General Meade, not sent, and packed it away. He did not destroy it. And I think that's significant because I think Lincoln felt that that letter would, at some point in time in the future, that letter would show up, as it did. And we would learn, history would learn of Lincoln's disappointment in Meade's conduct of the pursuit. Lincoln would be able to provide a little bit of his feelings in a letter to General Howard. General Howard had written the president expressing support for General Meade for his conduct at Gettysburg and during Lee's retreat, and that he felt that Howard felt that Meade had done a good job. And Lincoln wrote back to Howard, and in his letter, he did express some of the frustration and the disappointment that he had with General Meade's conduct. So I'm sure he was certain that General Meade would see the letter, that General Howard would show him the president's letter, and he did. So Lincoln was able to provide a little bit of his dissatisfaction, a little bit of what had bothered him to General Meade in a little bit of a roundabout way through General Howard. In assessment of the 11 days after the battle, we saw a lot of lost opportunities. Meade had a lot of information. His army was reinforced. Whatever deprivations his army would suffer in terms of any lack of supplies, lack of shoes, were certainly much more for Lee's army, which had to retreat with supplies, with wounded, with everything. Meade wasn't encumbered by trains. He wasn't encumbered with wounded or prisoners of war. So Lee did a phenomenal job, actually, of conducting his retreat. So it was a series of lost opportunities that we relate throughout the course of the book, some of which I've related to you. And that Lee had actually, while losing the Battle of Gettysburg, he had won the Battle of the Retreat and the Pursuit. And the war would go on, basically, the rest of the war in the East under the command of General Grant, who, while commanding all Union armies, he would spend most of his time with General Meade and the Army of the Potomac, indicating Grant's opinion of the significance of that theater of war, even though in the West, the Confederates were on the decline, especially at the fall of Vicksburg at the same time as the victory at Gettysburg. General Meade gave us a bit of an idea of what he expected us to do, what he expected his army to do, what he expected his orders were to be, when he told his wife that the proper policy of the administration of the Union Army was to drive Lee's troops, Lee's army out of the North, Pennsylvania, Maryland, I guess they kind of forgot West Virginia, and then to reorganize the army and then conduct offensive operations and engage Lee when Meade would be certain of success, which he had indicated a couple of times before, that he would operate offensively if he would be certain of success. Well, in wartime, we know that doesn't happen, but that gives you an indication that Meade was more interested, his guiding policy or planning was just to follow Lee and make sure that Lee did successfully retreat, and not to try and engage army with his army that he felt was the last line of defense between a possible offensive operation by Lee in Washington, D.C. That opinion came up a couple of times, especially at the conference, the Commanders' Council on the 13th, that Meade was content to have Lee back across the Potomac. That was what would have been primary, his purpose. And there was also the idea that they did not want to tarnish the victory at Gettysburg by possibly losing a battle. If he attacked Lee's line at Williamsport and was repulsed, it would tarnish the victory at Gettysburg. So for the course of the war, General George Gordon Meade would feel that he had not received the accolades, the recognition that he felt he had rightfully won at Gettysburg. And history would treat Meade kind of strangely. With Grant there with the army, Meade was kind of always in the background. And it seems that every year we see magazine articles that talk about General Meade being the unknown general at Gettysburg, that everybody knows Lee was there. And the opportunity to lead his army against a defeated adversary and attack and possibly end the war at Williamsport, what would have been known as the Battle of Williamsport probably, that Meade had missed an opportunity that he felt he did not have. So his legacy, based primarily on the 11 days after Gettysburg, that what Meade's true ability as a general would be formed, we would know what it was after Gettysburg based on what he would do, and especially when he had the opportunity to attack Lee at Williamsport and did not do so. And that has left Meade's legacy somewhat tarnished. So Meade during the critical, during those fateful 11 days, did not meet expectations. And he did not live up to his analysis of the failures of his predecessors who he had analyzed in detail. And he said that you need to take risks. So Meade's legacy is somewhat uneven between the Battle of Gettysburg and the 11 days from the end of the battle until Lee took his army back into Virginia. And with that, I would like to close with a small anecdote of after the battle and after the retreat, after Lee's crossing. And not long after the Battle of Gettysburg, Meade was in Washington, D.C., and he met the president in Washington. And Mr. Lincoln said, "Do you know, General," and this is how the quote went, do you know, General," Mr. Lincoln suddenly broke out with a laugh, "what your attitude towards Lee for a week after the Battle of Gettysburg reminded me of?" "No, Mr. President. What is it?" asked Meade. I could think of nothing else, said Lincoln, than an old woman trying to shoo her geese across the creek. Thank you.